Charlotte Winters didn't notice her wallet slip from her bag as she rushed across the crowded Manhattan sidewalk, her arms full of paperwork and the remnants of a hastily eaten bagel. She had exactly 5 minutes to make it into the towering office building ahead before she was late for her third job interview this week. Behind her, a man bent down, picking up the sleek leather wallet from the pavement. He turned it over in his hands, glancing at the ID inside: Charlotte Winters. A simple name, yet something about it made him pause. Noah Kingsley wasn't the type to stop for strangers. As CEO of Kingsley Enterprises, his days were meticulously scheduled, his time too valuable for distractions. But for some reason, he found himself looking up, searching the crowd for the woman who had unknowingly left a piece of her life behind. He spotted her just as she disappeared into the revolving doors of the glass skyscraper. Noah glanced at his watch. He had a board meeting in 10 minutes. He should have handed the wallet off to his assistant and moved on with his day. But instead, he found himself striding toward the building's entrance, wallet in hand, curiosity buzzing inside him like an unfamiliar itch. Charlotte barely had time to catch her breath before the receptionist called her name. She smoothed down her blazer, ignoring the way her nerves twisted in her stomach. This job was her last shot. Rent was due. Her savings were gone. She stepped into the high-rise office, ready to face whatever was ahead. Except she wasn't prepared for the man standing inside. Noah Kingsley sat at the head of the conference table, his piercing blue eyes locking onto her the moment she walked in. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp features and a presence that filled the room effortlessly. He wasn't just any executive, he was the CEO. Her stomach dropped. Oh no. Noah raised an eyebrow, lifting her wallet between his fingers. "Miss Winters," he said smoothly, "I believe you dropped this." Charlotte's face burned as she reached for it. "Oh, thank you." "I didn't even realize. You were in a hurry," he noted. "And now I assume you're here for an interview." Her throat went dry. "This is a disaster." The HR manager, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, cleared her throat. "Shall we begin?" Noah shouldn't have stayed. His assistant had already prepared the interview panel. He had no reason to be here. Yet, as Charlotte settled into the chair across from him, something inside him told him to stay. And for the first time in years, Noah Kingsley listened to his instincts. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the edges of her wallet as she tried to steady her pulse. The weight of Noah Kingsley's gaze was unnerving, but she refused to let it shake her. She needed this job. The HR manager smiled kindly, oblivious to the tension between them. "Miss Winters, why don't you start by telling us a little about yourself?" Charlotte forced a composed breath. "Of course, I have a background in marketing and analytics. I graduated top of my class at NYU and have spent the last few years working in fast-paced environments where I managed client accounts and developed strategic campaigns. I believe my ability to adapt quickly and think creatively makes me a strong fit for this role." Her voice was steady, confident. She had practiced this answer 100 times before, but now, under Noah's assessing gaze, it felt like a test she wasn't sure she was passing. One of the other executives leaned forward. "And what drew you to Kingsley Enterprises?" Charlotte answered without hesitation. "It's one of the most innovative firms in the industry. Your campaigns redefine market trends, and your leadership in global expansion is unmatched. I want to be part of a company that pushes boundaries." Noah studied her, silent. There was something about the way she spoke, composed yet passionate, as if she had memorized her lines but truly believed them. He had seen countless candidates walk through these doors, all saying the same things, but with her, something was different. "Impressive credentials," another interviewer noted. "But this position requires handling high-stakes clients. How do you perform under pressure?" Charlotte met the woman's gaze head-on. "Pressure sharpens my focus." In my previous role, I was thrown into a last-minute project where I had to overhaul a failing campaign in 48 hours. I worked non-stop, restructured the strategy, and the client renewed their contract for another year. Noah's fingers tapped lightly against the table. She was sharp, direct. He liked that. The HR manager smiled. That's exactly the kind of initiative we value. But Noah wasn't done. He leaned forward slightly, his voice smooth yet probing. "And what would you say is your greatest weakness, Miss Winters?" Charlotte hesitated for the briefest moment, but she didn't let it show. "I used to struggle with delegation. I've always taken pride in my work, and sometimes I felt the need to handle everything myself. But I've learned that trusting a team leads to stronger results. I've worked hard to improve that aspect of my leadership." Noah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He appreciated honesty. Too many people spewed rehearsed answers designed to impress. But she had given a real response. The interview continued, each question testing her poise, her capability. Charlotte answered everyone with precision, never faltering. Then, just as they were wrapping up, Noah spoke again. "One last question." Charlotte turned to him, bracing herself. "If given an impossible deadline with a client threatening to walk, how would you handle it?" She didn't miss the challenge in his voice. "I'd assess the situation, prioritize the most impactful solutions, and communicate transparently with the client," she said. "Sometimes people just need to feel heard. If I could salvage the relationship with negotiation, I would. And if not, I'd ensure that our company maintained its integrity and didn't promise something we couldn't deliver." Silence stretched for a moment. Then Noah gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The HR manager smiled. "Thank you, Miss Winters. We'll be in touch soon." Charlotte stood, offering a polite nod to everyone at the table. As she turned to leave, Noah's voice stopped her. "Miss Winters." She faced him again, pulse spiking. He held her wallet between his fingers once more, this time offering it properly. "Try not to lose this again," he said, his voice unreadable. Her breath hitched, but she took it from him smoothly. "I'll keep that in mind." Then, without another word, she walked out. Noah watched her go, something unfamiliar settling in his chest. He had interviewed hundreds of candidates. None had ever left him feeling like this. Charlotte stepped onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk, her head high but her heart racing. She had no idea whether she had impressed them enough to land the job, but she had given it everything she had. That was all she could do. She tucked her wallet securely into her bag this time, unwilling to make the same mistake twice. The encounter with Noah Kingsley still lingered in her mind, the way his gaze had felt like it was peeling back layers she hadn't even realized she was wearing. But she shook it off. He was just another powerful CEO, one of many in this city. It wasn't until the next evening, as she sat in her tiny apartment scrolling through job listings, that her phone buzzed with an email notification. She read the opening line twice before it truly registered. Kingsley Enterprises was offering her the job. Relief flooded her, followed quickly by something else: determination. This wasn't just another paycheck. It was a chance to prove herself in a world where people like her rarely got a foot in the door. Her first day arrived faster than she expected. Dressed in a crisp navy blouse and tailored slacks, she stepped into the gleaming skyscraper, her heels clicking against the polished floors. The office was a whirlwind of sleek desks, fast conversations, and the scent of expensive coffee. Her direct supervisor, a woman named Evelyn Carter, greeted her with a brisk nod and showed her to her workstation. The space was modern and minimalist, all cool grays and glass accents. Though Charlotte was new, she could already feel the pulse of ambition that ran through the office like an electric current. Evelyn handed her a folder. "Your first task is to refine this proposal before the client meeting tomorrow. Tighten the messaging, make the numbers more compelling. I assume you can handle that. Charlotte met her gaze without hesitation. Absolutely. She spent the next several hours immersed in data, tweaking language, restructuring key points. The challenge was exhilarating. She had always thrived under pressure, and this was no exception. A few desks away, hushed voices carried through the space. She was personally interviewed by Kingsley. Yeah, and now she's here. Wonder what makes her so special. Charlotte ignored them, keeping her focus locked on her work. She had no control over what people assumed. The only way to prove herself was through results. As the office emptied out for the evening, she remained at her desk, determined to perfect the proposal. The city lights glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the room. A deep voice interrupted her concentration. Still here. She looked up, pulse stuttering for only a second before she masked it. Noah stood a few feet away, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. Just making sure everything is ready for tomorrow's meeting, she said evenly. He studied her for a moment, then glanced at her screen. Show me what you've got. She hesitated but turned the monitor toward him. He scanned the document, his gaze sharp as he absorbed the changes she had made. After a long silence, he spoke. You restructured the financial projections. They were buried too deep in the original format. This way, the client sees the numbers up front, with the supporting data reinforcing the decision. His lips pressed into a thoughtful line. It's better. A strange warmth settled in her chest at the simple acknowledgement. Then, without another word, he reached forward and adjusted a single line of text before straightening. Now it's perfect. Charlotte glanced down at the minor change. It was subtle, but it did make the message stronger. When she looked back up, he was watching her, something unreadable in his expression. You'll do well here, he said, then turned and walked away. She exhaled, only then realizing how tightly wounded she had been. Noah Kingsley was a man who expected excellence. And if she wanted to succeed, she would have to deliver nothing less. Charlotte barely had time to process the whirlwind of her first days at Kingsley Enterprises before she was thrown into the depths of its high-stakes world. The company moved at her relentless pace, and she was determined to keep up. She spent long hours refining proposals, attending strategy meetings, and navigating the unspoken hierarchies of the office. But what she hadn't expected was Noah Kingsley's presence at every turn. At first, she assumed their interactions were incidental. A passing glance in the hallway, a brief acknowledgement in meetings, but soon it became clear that he was paying attention. To her work, to her ideas, to her. Noah rarely gave praise, but when he did, it was deliberate, precise. He wouldn't offer empty words or superficial compliments. Instead, he would challenge, refine, push her to elevate her thinking. And somehow, that was more intoxicating than any flattery could have been. One evening, as the office emptied out, Charlotte remained at her desk, finalizing details for an upcoming client pitch. The quiet hum of the city beyond the windows was the only sound until footsteps approached. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Noah stopped beside her, his presence commanding without effort. He leaned slightly, scanning the presentation on her screen. She didn't speak, waiting for his inevitable critique. After a long pause, he said, "You adjusted the engagement metrics." "They weren't reflecting real-world retention," she replied. "If we want long-term loyalty, the strategy needs to prioritize sustained interaction, not just initial impressions." A flicker of something passed through his expression. Approval, maybe. "You're not afraid to challenge conventional approaches," he noted. She met his gaze. "Is that a problem?" His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "Not at all." The moment stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he straightened. "Be ready for tomorrow," he said before walking away. Charlotte exhaled slowly, staring at the empty space he left behind. She had expected Kingsley Enterprises to be a challenge. She hadn't expected Noah Kingsley to be the biggest challenge of all. Charlotte had barely settled into her routine at Kingsley Enterprises before her workload doubled overnight. The company was preparing for a high-profile merger, and the executives were under immense pressure to finalize the deal. As the newest team member, she was expected to keep up without hesitation. She welcomed the challenge, proving herself with each task she completed, but the long hours were beginning to take a toll. Late one evening, the office was nearly empty when she found herself buried in financial reports, cross-referencing projections for an upcoming client presentation. The glow of her screen illuminated her face as she made careful adjustments, ensuring the data aligned with the firm's positioning strategy. The pressure to be flawless weighed heavily, but she refused to cut corners. A quiet presence shifted in the room, and she looked up to see Noah standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak right away, his gaze flickering to the documents spread across her desk before returning to her. She straightened slightly, bracing for whatever critique he was about to offer. Instead, he set a black folder on the desk beside her. "This is the data you're missing," he said. "If you're going to optimize the projections, you need the real figures, not just estimates." Her brow furrowed as she flipped through the pages. He was right. This information changed everything. She hadn't even realized she was working with incomplete data, but now that she saw it, it was obvious. She glanced up at him, reluctant to offer outright gratitude, but unable to deny that he had just saved her hours of additional work. "How did you know I needed this?" His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his gaze. "I pay attention." A tense silence stretched between them before he finally added, "You should go home after this." She let out a quiet breath, shaking her head. "Not until I finish." His jaw tightened slightly, as if he wanted to argue, but instead, he just gave a slow nod and turned to leave. She sat there for a moment, staring at the space where he had just been before refocusing on the work in front of her. Noah Kingsley was a man who demanded the best. But tonight, for the first time, she wondered if he also wanted to make sure she wasn't completely drowning. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at the office feeling the weight of exhaustion, but also the satisfaction of having completed the report with absolute precision. The executive team gathered in the sleek glass conference room, with Noah seated at the head of the table. She took her designated seat, forcing herself to remain sharp despite the lack of sleep. As the presentation began, she listened carefully, waiting for her moment to speak. Evelyn, her supervisor, handled the introduction before nodding toward Charlotte. "Miss Winters, walk us through the updated projection analysis." Charlotte stood, keeping her posture poised as she navigated the presentation with practiced ease. She laid out the data methodically, showing how the adjustments would not only secure the client's confidence, but also increase long-term profitability. Noah remained silent as she spoke, his expression unreadable, but she could feel his focus on every word. The other executives listened intently, nodding in approval at key points. When she finished, she returned to her seat, her pulse steady despite the high stakes. The silence that followed was brief before one of the senior partners spoke. "That was a sharp analysis. It gives us a stronger position in negotiations." Another executive nodded. "Agreed. This approach is exactly what we needed." Evelyn cast Charlotte a glance of approval before turning to Noah. "What do you think?" Noah leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled as he considered the presentation. Then, in a measured tone, he said, "It's airtight." The simple statement carried more weight than any elaborate praise could have. The room moved forward with discussions on the next steps, but Charlotte felt the subtle shift in the air. She had just solidified her place in this company. When the meeting concluded, the executives filed out one by one. Charlotte gathered her notes, preparing to leave when Noah's voice cut through the quiet. "Winters." She looked up. He was still seated, watching her with that same unreadable intensity. "I want you on the next phase of the project," he said. "You'll work directly with me." She hesitated, caught off guard. "I thought Evelyn was leading that." "She is," he confirmed, "but I want your input. You've proven you think beyond the expected." There was no room for negotiation in his tone, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite define. She nodded, keeping her voice steady. "Of course." As she turned to leave, she felt the weight of his gaze lingering on her, and for the first time since joining Kingsley Enterprises, she realized she wasn't just proving herself anymore. Noah Kingsley had taken notice of her in a way that went beyond business. And that, more than anything else, was dangerous. Charlotte adjusted the strap of her bag as she exited the conference room, her mind already racing through the implications of Noah's directive. Working directly with him meant more scrutiny, more pressure, but she thrived under both. Still, she couldn't ignore the way his words had settled under her skin, like a brand she couldn't shake. She made her way back to her desk, opening her laptop to review the next phase of the project. The numbers were solid, the projections tight, but something nagged at her. Noah had a reputation for expecting perfection, but he also had an instinct for seeing what others missed. If he wanted her involved, it meant there was something more to uncover. As she scanned the reports, a shadow fell over her desk. She looked up to find Evelyn standing there, arms crossed. "You made an impression," Evelyn said, her tone neutral, though Charlotte detected something beneath it: curiosity, maybe even a hint of caution. "I did my job," Charlotte replied simply. Evelyn studied her for a moment before nodding. "Kingsley doesn't bring people into his inner circle unless he sees potential. Just be ready. It's different when you're working at his level." Charlotte met her gaze steadily. "I can handle it." Evelyn gave the barest hint of a smile. "We'll see." With that, she walked away, leaving Charlotte with the distinct feeling that she was being tested in more ways than one. Later that evening, as the office emptied, Charlotte remained at her desk, refining her strategy. She was deep in concentration when a familiar presence settled beside her. Noah didn't speak at first, his gaze flicking to her screen. Then, after a moment, he said, "You're adjusting the client segmentation." She nodded, her fingers poised over the keyboard. "The original breakdown doesn't account for behavioral shifts in the market. We need to anticipate movement before it happens, not react to it after the fact." He studied her work, his expression unreadable. Then, after a beat, he said, "Good, but you're missing something." She tensed, not in defensiveness but in challenge. "What am I missing?" He reached past her, adjusting the data parameters with swift precision. "Long-term scalability. If we restructure for short-term gains, we risk volatility. This keeps it stable." Charlotte exhaled, absorbing the change. It was subtle but critical. She glanced up at him. "You always see 3 steps ahead." His gaze held hers for a fraction too long before he said, "It's the only way to stay ahead." The moment stretched between them, the quiet hum of the office the only sound. Then, as if breaking whatever had settled between them, he straightened. "Send me the finalized version by morning." She nodded, watching as he turned and walked away. Only when he disappeared into his office did she let out a slow breath, her pulse unsteady. Noah Kingsley was a man who demanded excellence. But tonight, for the first time, she wondered if he was testing more than just her skills. Charlotte barely had a moment to breathe before the next phase of the project consumed her. Working under Noah's direct oversight meant each day was a relentless push toward perfection. Their interactions were sharp, efficient, every conversation packed with precise critiques and unspoken challenges. She moved through the office with purpose, her focus honed to a razor's edge as she prepared for the upcoming client negotiations. The weight of expectation sat heavily on her shoulders, but she refused to falter. By the time she stepped into the sleek boardroom for the next strategy session, the air was thick with tension. Executives filled the space, their quiet murmurs underscoring the high stakes of the impending deal. Charlotte took her seat, her eyes scanning the documents in front of her, absorbing every detail. Noah entered last, his presence commanding without effort. The room settled as he took his place at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping over the team before landing on her. She met his stare without hesitation. The discussion began swiftly, numbers and projections exchanged with precision. Charlotte listened intently, waiting for the right moment to contribute. When a senior analyst presented an outdated forecast, she leaned forward, her voice cutting through the conversation. "The data model doesn't account for the latest market fluctuations," she pointed out. "If we move forward with these projections, we're underestimating the risk exposure." A brief silence followed. Some of the executives exchanged glances, but Noah's expression didn't waver. "What's your alternative?" he asked, his tone devoid of indulgence. Charlotte didn't hesitate. "A dynamic approach to pricing adjustments. We implement an adaptive strategy that shifts based on real-time demand, rather than relying on static forecasts." A few of the senior partners murmured in consideration. One of them leaned back, arms crossed. "That's an aggressive shift." "It's necessary," Charlotte countered. "If we don't anticipate volatility, we'll be reacting instead of leading." Another pause. Then Noah spoke. "She's right." The weight of his agreement settled over the room. The discussion moved forward, but Charlotte felt the shift, the subtle acknowledgement of her growing influence in this space. When the meeting concluded, she gathered her materials, preparing to leave, but Noah's voice stopped her. "Winters, stay," the others filtered out, leaving them alone in the vast boardroom. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, studying her with that same unreadable intensity. "That was a risk." She held his gaze. "It was necessary." A slow nod. "You didn't hesitate. I couldn't afford to." The silence between them stretched, charged with something unspoken. Then, after a beat, he said, "Come with me." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked toward the private elevator at the end of the corridor. Charlotte hesitated for only a moment before following. They rode in silence as the elevator ascended. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space unlike any she had seen before. Noah's private office. A sleek, expansive corner suite overlooking the city skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering expanse of Manhattan, the lights casting a quiet glow over the minimalist design. A bar lined one wall, a modern desk sat near the window, and the entire space felt distinctly like him, controlled, precise, powerful. He moved to the bar, pouring a glass of water before setting it on the table in front of her. "You've earned your place in that room," he said simply. She met his gaze, searching for the angle, the expectation. "Is that why we're here?" "No." He studied her for a long moment before saying, "I want to know what you want from this." She exhaled slowly, considering his words. "I want to build something that lasts, to prove that I belong in this world, not just as someone capable, but as someone indispensable." His eyes darkened slightly. "And what happens when you get there?" "I don't stop." A flicker of something passed through his expression, something close to recognition. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he said, "Neither do I." The air between them shifted, something unspoken settling into place. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at it, his expression hardening slightly. "This conversation isn't finished," he said, his tone final. She nodded once, then turned to leave, her pulse thrumming. As she stepped back into the elevator, she knew one thing for certain: Noah Kingsley wasn't just testing her ambition. He was testing something far more dangerous. Charlotte had never felt pressure like this before. The merger negotiations were reaching their final stages, and every decision, every calculation carried weight. It wasn't just about proving herself anymore, she was too deep in it for that. Now, she had real influence. She wasn't just another ambitious employee, she was a key player, someone people turned to for answers. And Noah saw it. He didn't just see it, he expected it. Their late nights working together had become routine, their conversations evolving from sharp critiques to something deeper. He challenged her, yes, but there was an understanding between them, a magnetic pull that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Tonight was no different. The office was empty except for them, the glow of the city casting long shadows through the glass walls. Charlotte leaned over her laptop, finalizing the client transition plan, when she felt him watching her. She didn't look up immediately. Instead, she finished typing her thought before closing the document. Only then did she meet his gaze. "You've been quiet," he observed, his voice smooth but edged with something else, curiosity maybe. She exhaled, rubbing her temples. "I'm running through worst-case scenarios in my head. Making sure I haven't missed anything." "You haven't," he said without hesitation. She let out a small, tired laugh. "That's a lot of faith to put in someone who's only been here a few months." His expression didn't waver. "I don't give out faith easily, you've earned it." Something about the way he said it made her pulse stutter. She swallowed. "We'll see if you still think that after tomorrow's final negotiations." He leaned back against the edge of the table, crossing his arms. "I already know how tomorrow will go." "Oh." "You'll walk in there, break down the numbers better than anyone else, and leave them with no choice but to agree," he said simply. "Because that's what you do." The certainty in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. She should have looked away, should have broken the tension that thickened the air between them. But she didn't. Instead, she said, "And what do you do, Noah?" His jaw tightened slightly, like he hadn't expected the question. "I make sure the right people are in the right place. And I don't make mistakes when it comes to that." She could hear what he wasn't saying. He had chosen her. A phone buzzed in the distance, shattering the quiet moment. Noah pushed off the table, his focus shifting back to work. But the air between them still crackled, an unspoken truth lingering in the space they left behind. Tomorrow the deal would be finalized. And after that, she had no idea what came after that. The meeting was brutal. The other executives had warned her that the final stage of negotiations would be the hardest part, and they weren't wrong. The opposing firm was ruthless, their legal team tearing through every clause, every figure looking for weaknesses. Charlotte held her ground. She countered every challenge with precision, turning their attacks into opportunities. She adjusted terms in real time, recalibrated projections on the spot, and refused to let them corner her. Halfway through, she stole a glance at Noah. He was watching her, his face unreadable, but something in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't worried. Because he believed in her, and that was all she needed to push through the final stretch. By the time the last signature was inked onto the contract, the tension in the room shifted. The opposing team exchanged stiff handshakes before exiting, leaving only the Kingsley Enterprises executives behind. There was a beat of silence. Then Evelyn exhaled sharply. Well, that was a bloodbath. Charlotte finally allowed herself to breathe. Noah stood buttoning his suit jacket. We won. A murmur of agreement passed through the room, but Charlotte barely registered it. Her pulse was still racing, the adrenaline refusing to settle. Noah caught her gaze. "Come with me," he said. She barely had time to process before she was following him out of the boardroom, down the hall, into the private elevator. The second the doors closed, the energy between them shifted. It was just the two of them now, alone. Charlotte exhaled, pressing her back against the elevator wall. That was incredible, he finished for her. She let out a breathless laugh. Stressful? You didn't look stressed, he countered. She shook her head, heart still pounding. I was holding it together. His lips curved slightly. You didn't need to. You had it under control the entire time. The elevator doors slid open, revealing his office. But tonight it felt different, less like a place of business and more like. She didn't know how to describe it. Noah walked to the bar, pouring 2 drinks. He handed her one without a word. She took it, fingers brushing against his for the briefest second. They stood there, the city stretching beyond the glass windows, the weight of what they had just accomplished settling in. Then Noah spoke. I knew you would win that negotiation, he said. She took a slow sip, the warmth of the drink settling in her chest. How? He turned to her, his gaze more intense than she'd ever seen it. Because I know you, Charlotte, her breath caught. He had never said anything like that before. She set her glass down, pulse hammering. Noah, but she didn't know what to say. Because if she said anything, if she acknowledged what was happening between them, there would be no turning back. He took a step closer. Her heart skipped a beat. I don't mix business with emotion, he said, his voice lower now. She swallowed. Neither do I. Another step. But this, he murmured, isn't just business. She felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her. She had known for weeks that something was building between them, but hearing him say it changed everything. She could feel the heat of him now, the space between them disappearing inch by inch. She had a choice. She could walk away, pretend this moment never happened, keep things professional. Or she could admit the truth, that she wanted this, that she wanted him. She made her decision. Without another word, she closed the distance between them. Charlotte barely had time to process what was happening before her pulse took over, thrumming beneath her skin as the space between them disappeared. Noah was close enough now that she could see the way his gaze darkened, the way his fingers flexed like he was barely restraining himself. The air between them was charged, every second stretching impossibly long. She had always been careful, always calculated her steps before taking them. But standing here, with Noah watching her like she was something inevitable, she didn't want to think. She just wanted to feel. The city lights flickered against the glass behind him, casting a glow over the sharp angles of his face. He was always so composed, so perfectly in control, but tonight, there was something raw beneath the surface. She moved first. Her breath hitched as she reached for him, her fingers brushing against the crisp fabric of his suit before gripping the lapel. His reaction was immediate, a sharp inhale, his hands coming up to frame her waist, firm, steady. He wasn't hesitant, but he wasn't rushing either. It was as if he was savoring this moment, the inevitability of it. She tilted her chin up, her lips just shy of his, her heart hammering so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. Then, finally, he closed the distance. The world outside the office ceased to exist. Charlotte had never understood how people described time standing still until now. It wasn't just the way he kissed her, it was the way he held her, the way he made her feel like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. His grip was sure, his touch deliberate, like he had been waiting for this as long as she had. When they finally broke apart, she was breathless, her head spinning. Noah didn't step back. He stayed close, his forehead nearly brushing hers as his fingers traced slow circles against her back. For the first time since she met him, he looked uncertain. It was a fleeting hesitation, but she saw it the way his jaw tightened slightly, like he was weighing something heavy. She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? His eyes met hers, and whatever uncertainty had flickered in him disappeared, replaced by something resolute. We stop pretending there's nothing between us. Her chest tightened, something warm unfurling inside her. She had spent so long convincing herself that this, whatever this was impossible. That it was dangerous, reckless. But standing here with Noah's hands still on her, she realized something. The real risk had never been falling for him. It had been denying that she already had. He exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening slightly at her waist before he pulled away, just enough to see her fully. "I don't do things halfway, Charlotte." She let out a breathless laugh. "I've noticed." A small smirk tugged at his lips, but it was gone just as quickly. His expression turned serious again, like he was letting her see a side of him he rarely showed. "I'm not going to pretend this is simple," he admitted, "but I'm also not going to let you go." Her heart clenched at the quiet intensity of his words. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Just certainty. And Charlotte had spent way too long being afraid of certainty. She lifted her hand, resting it lightly against his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I don't want you to." His breath hitched, just barely, but she caught it. Then, without another word, he kissed her again. This time, there was no hesitation. Noah's hand lingered at Charlotte's waist, his touch grounding her in the moment. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, casting a golden glow over his sharp features. There was something different in his expression now, something settled. Like a man who had just made a choice he had no intention of undoing. Charlotte's pulse was still racing, but it wasn't from uncertainty anymore. It was from the sheer gravity of what had just happened. For weeks, they had danced around this, keeping their attraction buried beneath professionalism and restraint. But now, standing here, there was no going back. Noah exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing against hers as he stepped back just enough to look at her fully. The weight of the moment pressed between them, unspoken but undeniable. Then, without warning, he reached for his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair and slipped it on with practiced ease. "Come with me," Charlotte blinked. "Where?" He didn't answer, just held out his hand. There was no hesitation in her when she took it. Minutes later, they were stepping out of the private elevator into the underground parking garage. Noah led her to a sleek black car, opening the door for her before circling around to the driver's seat. The moment he started the engine, the sound of the city faded behind them. Charlotte glanced at him as the car cut smoothly through the Manhattan streets. "You're not going to tell me where we're going, are you?" A ghost of a smile played at his lips. "You'll see." She settled into the seat, watching the city blur past. There was something strangely exhilarating about this, about letting go of the carefully constructed walls she had spent so long maintaining. 20 minutes later, the car slowed in front of a towering building, its glass facade reflecting the night sky. Charlotte recognized it immediately, one of the most exclusive residences in the city. Noah pulled into the private entrance, nodding at the doorman before stepping out and coming around to open her door. Charlotte followed him into the elevator, heart pounding as they ascended. When the doors slid open, she stepped into a penthouse that was both stunning and unmistakably his. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed an unobstructed view of the city, sleek furniture arranged with deliberate precision. The space was curated, refined but not cold. Noah stepped past her, loosening his tie as he walked toward the bar. He poured 2 drinks, setting one on the counter in front of her. Charlotte took it, studying him carefully. "So this is where you disappear to after those late nights at the office." His lips curved slightly. "Among other places." She sipped her drink, the warmth settling in her chest. "Why did you bring me here?" Noah leaned against the counter, watching her in that way that made her feel like he saw straight through her. "Because I wanted you to see the part of my life that isn't just boardrooms and negotiations." She set her glass down, meeting his gaze. "And what part is that?" He was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then, finally, he said, "The part where I stop pretending that work is the only thing that matters." Charlotte's breath caught at the quiet sincerity in his voice. Noah Kingsley, the man who never let emotions interfere with business, was standing in front of her, admitting that she had changed something in him. She stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Noah. He reached for her then, his hand settling at her waist, his touch firm but careful. "Stay," he said, his voice lower now. "Not just tonight, stay with me." Her heart clenched at the vulnerability laced in those words. He wasn't just asking her to be here in this moment. He was asking for more. She exhaled softly, lifting a hand to trace the edge of his jaw. "You don't have to do this alone." His grip on her tightened slightly, like he had been waiting to hear those words. And just like that, the last wall between them shattered. Charlotte didn't need any more time to think. She already knew the answer. She leaned in, pressing her lips to his, sealing the decision that had been inevitable from the moment they met. Noah pulled her into him, deepening the kiss with a certainty that left no room for doubt. This was it. No more barriers, no more pretending, just them, together. And for the first time in a long time, Charlotte knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.